Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest today. Good afternoon and greetings from our studio in Amsterdam that is being painted, so you might hear some background noise. I apologize for that. Before I introduce our guest, our special guest, John Elkington, for those of you who've never used the system before, if you want to pose a question or a comment, just type it in the lower right-hand corner. You'll see an area for that. If you want to applaud or think something is funny or brilliant, there are 3 emojis. Just press on that and it'll capture that. And if you need to send a private message to anyone in the space, just move your mouse over their name and a window will pop up and you can send them a private message. So I'm really incredibly thrilled today because one of my heroes and superheroes for the sustainability industry, John Elkington, has agreed to have a chat with us about is sustainability achievable in the present climate. So John, if you would turn on your video and your audio. For those of the audience that actually live in Mars and have never heard of you, you might want to give a little bit of background of what you've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, briefly, and basically how you see sustainability evolving. But thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, Richard, Robert, thank you so much for that. And I'm just going to try and answer the question in the best way that I can. But I've been 50 years now in the environmental and sustainability field. During that time, I've set up 4 companies since 1978. They all still exist. The third one, sustainability, which we set up in 1987, is now, of all people, owned by KKR last time I looked. And in 2008, we set up Frontlines, which is a relatively small London-based advisory firm and think tank. In terms of whether sustainability is achievable, of course, anything's always possible. But I think at the moment, people might be clutching their heads in their hands and thinking, nothing's possible, whether you look at the United States or you look at Brazil or wherever in the world you look, and particularly my own country, the United Kingdom. But I actually happen to believe that it's in times like this of complete meltdown, which in a way Valence has been predicting for about 5 or 6 years now, that the opportunity of driving forward properly defined system change starts to build quite powerfully. But it all depends then on whether the sustainability industry, if I can call it that, has the capacity to deliver what is needed and at scale and with the appropriate level of urgency. So Robert, back to you, if I may.
So you believe that the solutions are there, the technology and the talent is there. So what's the holdup?
Well, I think the holdup is very often that as a species, we tend to be singularly poor at either recognizing things that are slow to build but have monstrous longer term consequences. I mean, if we look at the COVID pandemic, just as one example. Nassim Nicholas Taleb was asked whether that had been a black swan. His answer was absolutely not. People in government and elsewhere had seen that set of risks. Coronavirus epidemics had been spotlighted, but we published reports and ignored them. We set up units that were meant to focus on that, and we shut them down. And I think in many ways we're repeating exactly those same sort of myopic failures of imagination and certainly failures of action, again, with things like the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency. But it doesn't mean that we won't ultimately wake up. But I think what happens when, after such a long time asleep, we have that Rip Van Winkle moment where people do wake up, it's everyone else's fault and we blame you. And, environmentalists, why didn't you tell us sooner? So I think we go into a sort of a period of action, but also scapegoating. So I'm not particularly looking forward to that stage, but it's going to come.
Well, you've been doing this 50 years. I'm sure not all of the clients and people and companies that engage with you were at a level of awareness that you wanted them to be, and they wanted you to get them there. Did you have to get them to jump on your shoulders and cross the street, or did you have to drag them, or were they really serious about it, or were most of them curious?
All of the above, Robert. I mean, I when I first started in the mid-70s, companies, businesses simply did not want to talk to people with any sort of environmental labeling or interests. And therefore, I set it as one of my early objectives to sort of try and break into companies and ultimately break into their boardrooms. Oddly, it went much faster than I had expected. Within 18 months to 2 years, we were starting to write environmental policy statements for companies like, God help us, BP, British Petroleum, and chemical companies and so on. But it was still seen as something that was peripheral, that was something that was driven by troublemakers and people you really wouldn't want to have home for a cocktail party or have your sort of children marry. And very often, if I go back even to the sort of mid-late 80s, I would go into boardrooms and other senior team meetings within business. And it was very clear that generation of business leaders saw environmentalists and their ilk as communists in disguise. We were meant to be anti-business, anti-growth, anti-capitalism, anti-everything. And it's certainly true that some of the early activists, groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, some of those people were all of that. But it didn't mean that they weren't worth listening to. And part of what we set ourselves as a mission was to getting those people in to exactly the same places within business that we were beginning to operate in. We never tried to stand and represent those people. We just tried to say that don't listen to us talking about what Oxfam or now, for example, Extinction Rebellion might be saying. Listen to them. And if you want to talk to them, we'll help pull them in.
But you've had so many conversations with C-suite executives, with boards who grabbed you in to help them. What have you found is the most effective trigger to get someone, maybe not as extreme as maybe DeSantis in Florida to become, a sustainable superhero, but what is the commonality in getting them to really see this is in their interest? What trigger did you find?
I think there have been multiple commonalities without trying to be sort of complicated about this, by which I mean through the 80s and 90s, the companies that were most alert to some of this stuff had tended to have a major disaster. Something had gone really massively wrong, whether they were Shell or Nike or Monsanto or whatever it might be. And therefore, but we never did risk management, and we never did sort of, emergency handling or anything like that. And we always made that clear. And in fact, after Shell ran into their problems in 1995, we refused to work with Shell for 2 years. This was sustainability. So at that time, the commonality was that people had to be shocked into understanding that something was going on in the wider world that they didn't properly understand. I think the commonality over time has shifted. it still helps sometimes to have people sort of whacked around the head with a 2x4 or whatever it might be. But I think increasingly you've seen companies waking up to the fact that either upwards or downwards or outwards in their value chains and webs, people were starting to wake up to some of the stuff. So, for example, 2005, Hurricane Katrina whacks New Orleans. Walmart wakes up, loses something like 100 stores overnight, and just thinks, this is not the way we're going to be able to do sensible business in the future. So let's really rattle our supply chain and really force energy efficiency. That was manageable for them, and sort of they were able to get their brains around that piece. And so natural disasters help as well. But I think now what's happening, in addition to those supply chain dynamics, there's just a very different generation of people running companies, and they take this stuff, if not always for granted. They know they have to deal with it. They know they have to work out ways of aiming off, understanding where the system dynamics are going to take their markets, the implications through finance and through talent recruitment and all these other things, and regulatory activity over time. So I think probably 20, 25 years ago, I started to see a very different mood in the sort of global C-suite, if I can put it that way. We wouldn't have done then. In the sense people knew they had to do this stuff. Now, I think they not only know they have to do it, but they're really quite alert to the fact that some of the competitors are doing some of this stuff already, and they're keen to be doing some of it themselves. Just final point. I mean, one of the things I've really picked up strongly in the last sort of 3-4 years, actually a bit longer than that, 5-6 years, is director level in business saying, I'm getting beaten up. I'm getting beaten up at the breakfast table. My teenage children are saying, are you an eco-criminal? That's what, and that has real import. That has real impact on people when, it comes through the personal, the family route. And I think that's what's happened. People have generally sort of waking up to the fact that this is real. It's happening. It has consequences, and we're largely to blame. And that for me is new. That is creating a new impetus in business. Not fast enough yet, not at the scale we would need yet, but it's coming.
But I've known you for a while, and you always seem to be quite chill, relaxed. Where I have a tendency to tell people that their children are ugly, and say why they're ugly.
You're not coming home anytime soon, Robert.
But you seem to have found a way of still nudging those companies in a direction, and helping them get to a place where they might not know they really need to be there now. And how are you able to do that? Because I would think sometimes, particularly maybe when you started, it must have been very frustrating.
It was.
That you're having to explain the obvious.
Yeah. Well, we even had moments back in the late 1980s where some of our clients sued us. So, for example, in 1988, I did. They did. I mean, to your point, I do work, and my organizations have worked with business. That's what we do.
Yeah.
But if things do not seem to be moving fast enough, we're not passive in this, and we've always said that to our clients. We're trying to be objective, not today, but in 10 to 15 years. So we're trying to bring that emergent reality back into your world and have you understand that. And the reason why some of those companies sued us was one of our clients at the time, ICI, which is now long gone, very big global chemical company at the time. One of their key people, a group environment advisor, said to me, I'd organized an exhibition called The Green Designer in London. And he said, it's all very well environmentalists like you telling us this is what we should do, but the consumer isn't interested. So I thought, well, that's interesting. What could we do about that? Well, let's do a green consumer guide and tell consumers what they might do. The book sold 1 million copies in 18 months, went into 20 foreign language editions very, very speedily, and was an absolute pain in the neck for companies like Unilever, Procter and Gamble. I mean, all sorts of folk. And the reason why ICI, three different parts of ICI tried to sue us at the same time. None of them knew what the others were doing, and none of them knew that at the time we were working with ICI's chairman, John Harvey Jones. So it was a very peculiar situation. Monsanto also sued us. Sorry, no, I'm wrong there. McDonald's sued us, and we won all of those cases, but it was a weeny bit of a distraction. So to your question, we're not passive, we're not neutral. We try and be professional and objective in what we do, but what we're trying to do is to get business moving at speed and with a real sense of urgency and taking the level of sort of risks that they wouldn't normally take. To your earlier question around reading on all of this, I think our sample would be skewed in terms of companies, because the sorts of businesses that come to us sort of know who we are and sort of know how we operate. So they know they're taking something of a risk. But the really weird thing, and then I'll very quickly come to your question about how does one have patience when things are not moving in the right direction. But given all of that, it's rather peculiar, I continue to find, that many of our relationships with companies tend to be very long lasting. And I think part of that is because they've had to take a set of risks. They've had to almost swallow their corporate pride in order to sort of get involved with us in the first place. And then that patience thing. I was born an optimist. I often say, you couldn't do what you and I have done without believing that progress was possible, and in some sort of timescale, if not always the one that we wanted. And I also believe, and I've studied this for a long time, that change doesn't go in straight lines. It goes in waves, and there are periods where things are going backwards. I know 4 or 5 times, certainly in my working life, and I'm sure in yours, Robert, that we've had these moments where everything is going backwards. And the odd thing this time around is I don't think that's going to happen to anything like the same extent. I think the change agenda is now so mainstreamed, it's going to be impossible to shake out. Doesn't mean that it's sort of slowed down and all the rest of it, but it's that confidence that the system has to change, and therefore it will change, and therefore the right sort of catalytic actions could play an important role in all of that. That's what I think drives me along.
I found a quote. I don't know what year you said this, but it says, "I'm worried about greenwashing. I think we should come down on it very, very hard, whether it's with criminal intent or actively deceptive."
Well, I first started to sort of be aware of greenwashing and with some real sense of urgency was after the Green Consumer Guide, because suddenly everyone in business was claiming to be green, and it wasn't that activists hadn't warned us that would happen. They had, and so we tried to call out some of that. But what I did say also was that a certain amount of greenwashing or impact washing or whatever the latest fashion happens to be is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think what it tells you is that people, in this case in business, are starting to wake up, starting to see a need to do something, starting to need to feel that need to sort of communicate both internally and externally. And as human beings, we all screw up. I mean, I got your name wrong when we started simply because I'd just been talking to a Richard, and so, an addled brain.
My wife does the same thing.
Well, it's nice to be in that company, but I think that a certain amount of washing is to be accepted, but if somebody does it 2 or 3 times, then you come down on them like a ton of bricks.
We're seeing also more, maybe whistleblowers, not the right term, like Desiree Fixler and the woman from Shell, who we also have on, Carolyn Dennett, coming forward. And I always felt that it'll be hard for particularly the financial sector where we focus, to find the best and the brightest, passionate, committed, because they'll come in the bank, a private bank or investment bank, and see that the press releases are not in line with
Yeah.
what I mean, they had rabbis and imams going at BlackRock yesterday and doing a demonstration confronting BlackRock that you're not showing the true commitment to climate. But at the same time, at least if I look at the financial sector, I see lots of stories and 40 to 50 trillion dollars going into ESG,
Yeah.
which, come on, if it was going in, we wouldn't have any problems, but it's not going there. So, how do we, because how do we get through, you said pain, and I agree with you, pain is a very effective tool. But the crisis of personnel hasn't reached that
Yeah.
catastrophic level yet.
No. No, I think we're seeing ESG washing, and just to sort of continue that thread, and I think we're seeing a feeding frenzy, and we are a herd animal as a species. We tend to do things all at once because other people are doing it, and we want to be either involved or we don't want to be exposed on the margins to the predators or whatever it might be. And again, I think whether I like it or not, that is very often the way markets behave. It is, as people in Silicon Valley have often said, quoting Hemingway, it's a gradually then suddenly world. And I think we're now in the suddenly part where stuff that has been held back for a very, very long time is going to break through and actually going to hit people much more painfully than it would have done had they managed all of these sort of risks and opportunities sensibly. To your point about talent, I think it would be completely unreasonable for people of my age. I'm now 73. I feel I'm just oddly getting started in this space. I'm on the most ferocious learning curve, and if I'm given them the next 10 to 15 years, I really look forward to immensely. And partly, and I had a conversation earlier on today with somebody called Richard specifically about this, which was about the intergenerational dynamics that we see now, where younger people would have every reason to attack the old as betraying their longer term interests. And I'm a baby boomer, and I'm amazed in some ways that the younger generations haven't already done that. But I think if we're going to turn the corner on this one, and if sustainability is going to be a reality, then we have to work out how to work across the generational divides. We have to be aware of them and then bridge them. And so, to your point about talent, I think it's unreasonable to expect younger people to always protest when they first go into a recruitment conversation. But it's amazing how many of them are doing it and asking those questions. And it's again very interesting to see how there are certain functions within companies that are sensitive. Investor relations is one of them. That people are very acutely monitoring what people in the investment and financial worlds think. HR is another one, human resources. And if you get asked even a few questions by the people that you're really keen to recruit, and particularly some of them then go elsewhere, then that starts to register. And I think that is registering. It's been registering for a number of years, but I'm not expecting that to drive a huge conversion process within business or a massive disruption of the way business mindsets currently operate. But I think it's symptomatic, and it's symptomatic of the fact that that agenda that used to be on the outside is now absolutely the inside. And the people you're recruiting, they're natives in this new agenda. They're not like the people you pulled in previously who might have worked, some of them, for an NGO and then converted to business or whatever. These people, this is what they want to be. This is what they want to see their employer doing.
Years ago, I used to teach MBA students at the Rotterdam School of Management on sustainable finance, but the school was not really that interested, so they forced me to become like the beekeeping course. So I had to squeeze in 12 different electives into one, and all the students were very keen on this and creating a career, but none of them pursued their interests. They were all worried about student loans. And I told them, if you really want to change a company, refuse to work for them when they come to recruit you, because you have leveraged them. but I
Yeah.
couldn't get through. Maybe the time was not right. I'm not sure if many students are doing it now, but they do have leverage before going in. Once you're in, it's hard to really make a fundamental change. I see more courses and electives and programs around ESG and impact and sustainability, but do you see students actually voting with their conscience in the company they're going to work for?
I do, but then it may be I see, as I said earlier on, a slightly skewed sample of companies. But when you look now at, for example, around the world, the Standard and Poor's 500, and you look at the proportion of those companies producing some sort of sustainability report, I mean, it's over 90%, as you know. When I started, I mean, I remember we mentioned Shell a little while back, and I remember somebody very senior in Shell telling me in the mid-1980s, Shell will never produce a sustainability report or anything like it. We're too big and we're too complicated. So, that's why I think over time we have seen progress. We've seen this agenda being increasingly owned at board and C-suite level. We've seen a huge number of chief sustainability officers. I think that's symptomatic. It's not necessarily the critical driver that we will need. So we've seen business go up that learning curve. I think the financial markets, which you so ably and over decades tried to sort of seduce and influence and all the rest of it, have been much, much slower. Are in bits of the financial world, whether it's reinsurers or some venture capitalists or some private equity folk or whatever, or family offices, as you mentioned, chose relatively early to pursue some of this stuff. But there hadn't been until ESG came along, that sort of herd movement. I just hope that in a way that I was reading, and probably in the Financial Times in the last couple of days, about I can't even remember the name. It wasn't greenwashing. It was green, basically about holding your environmental sustainability, whatever stories, close to your chest and not talking about them because you were worried that you would be attacked. I hope these sort of challenges, which I think are actually healthy, they're part of the learning process for us all, don't put off the financial markets and they just go back to the business as usual. I don't think that's possible. I think they may be on the back foot for a little while, but my reading, at least, is that what you've been working for so long, Robert, is now actually beginning to happen. And again, it's one of those exponential curves where it starts very slow, seems to be going in the wrong direction quite often, and then boom, it's everywhere overnight, and you're either part of it or you're not. That doesn't mean that we won't have huge need for whistleblowers and people like that. We will. We need people inside companies who actually have gone in and established their sort of working lives within particular organizations, being able to stand up and talk about some of the bad stuff that will inevitably continue to happen. I have huge respect for people who do that, as long as they've tried within their organizations to promote that particular agenda. I don't think whistleblowing should be the default option. It should be the sort of the last, almost nuclear option.
I remember when we started, most of the people that we were engaged with of asset owners and managers, I say jokingly, I was focusing mainly on irresponsible investors and criminals.
Yeah.
They had more money and they had a better sense of humor. They're very pragmatic. Is there anybody that you won't work with?
Oh, there have been lots. I mean, if I go back 30 years, I mean, we were pretty much like the socially responsible investment crowd. We wouldn't work with anyone from the defense sector, although increasingly I think defense sector is going to have to open up to some of this sort of stuff. We wouldn't work with gambling and casinos. We wouldn't work with tobacco. And we've been pursued, I mean, both at Sustainability, my prior company, and then Volans, by companies in all of those sectors, but particularly in tobacco. And there, we've had Philip Morris International pursue us. And in the end, I thought, well, they're going into vaping. Vaping is 90-something% better than just smoking cigarettes. Maybe we should just go and have a look at what they're doing. And I went to see the CEO and the chief financial officer and the head of research and innovation and so on. At the end of that, I asked a question, which was, and with all of this vaping stuff, how are you going to fund that? And the answer was by selling more cigarettes in the developing countries. And I thought, we can't. I mean, there's no way we can work with a company like this. And now you see with vaping, it's going into children and all sorts of second and third order issues. There have also been on occasions, and we don't do it very often, but where we have resigned clients. And for example, a very long time ago, but we worked for 18 months for Monsanto under a different CEO than Bob Shapiro. And they brought us in to look at genetic engineering and how it was seen among stakeholders globally. And we did 18 months of work on that. And at the end of that, I concluded that they were headed for a brick wall in Europe. Flew to the States to talk to Bob Shapiro. He had to fly somewhere else that day, so I was fobbed off by the head of the food business, Hugh Grant, who was then later chairman of the company. He knew nothing about the work that we were doing, so I decided to resign and to do so publicly. And about 4 months later, I was invited in by Bill Ford at the Ford Motor Company, and his second question to me was, if you had a relationship with Ford, what would it take to get you to the point where you'd want to resign that relationship? So again, we're peculiar, and we try not to be too peculiar, because then you don't have a business. But it is really important to us that the companies that we're working with are dedicated to change, and increasingly they tend to talk about transformation. And one of the reasons I've always kept organizations I've been involved in much smaller than the market would naturally have had them is, if you go for growth of that sort, you have to get into sales and marketing. And if you go into sales and marketing, you have absolutely no control over who you end up working with. And I've always said, if you're promoting your business on in terms of value, you have very little control over who you end up working with. If you do it on values, you potentially at least do have some control. And I've always emphasized that second approach wherever we possibly can. So, I mean, we're not desperate to resign clients. We're not desperate to say no to people, but sometimes you just have to.
Over the years, having done hundreds of thousands of different engagements, which one sticks out in your mind as your greatest accomplishment in the corporate sector, or that you felt, not even financially, but just, wow, we did make a real difference here?
It's difficult to choose, Robert, because it would certainly be hundreds. It certainly wouldn't be thousands of these sorts of engagements. But one that comes to mind would be, I mentioned the Green Consumer Guide. One of the companies it had a massive impact on was Novo Nordisk in Denmark. So at the time, they had both a healthcare sort of human growth hormone and insulin business, but they also had an industrial enzymes business, which is now spun out as Novozymes. And in the book, we talked about enzymes being potentially problematic, skin sensitization, a bunch of other things. It turned out that was a sort of an older issue. It had been largely dealt with. But when the book came out, suddenly their big customers, people like Unilever and Procter & Gamble, were starting to sort of ask very difficult questions, cut down on enzymes and so on, then used in biological detergents. And their then president, Mads Olesen, did something that was, in my experience at that time, very unusual. He sent 2 people to a conference I was speaking at in London, and their invitation to me was, would you come and see our president? I said, well, I mean, of course. And I took my co-author, Julia Hales, also co-founder of Sustainability, and we went to see Mads. And after we'd had this sort of getting to know you session, he said, you can go anywhere in Novo Nordisk you like. You can talk to anyone you want to, and then come back and tell me what you find. And we came back, we came back to London, then we went and did the work. But we came back and said, there are 3 things that you should do. And they were all very, very challenging things. And he said, fine, we'll work on all those three. And they did them.
Oh, wow.
And then one of those things was bring your not enemies exactly, but your most vociferous critics like Greenpeace and so on, anti-genetic engineering campaigners in. We'll help manage that process. We did. As it happened, in the second year that we did that, something went catastrophically wrong at the Novo end, but we worked our way through that. And then much later, I came up with a triple bottom line. They adopted the triple bottom line. In fact, you could say they were pretty much the first B corporation, although they didn't go through that certification route, because when they went through a very big demerger, the demerged and recombined company was built around the triple bottom line. So I look back at that company and working with a very, very young Lisa Kingo, who then later on went to run the Global Compact and so on, as one of the happiest processes that we've ever been involved in. I'm not saying it's the biggest impact one, but it certainly lives on in the memory.
Do you ever use the Dong transition from Dong Danish oil and natural gas to Ørsted? I don't know if you were ever involved with them with their transition, but I was quite impressed with the speed with which they've changed. So the energy sector can change.
It can. In the case of Dong and then Ørsted, I mean, it was partly because they sold off the offending bits of the business rather than
okay.
So our CEO is Danish, Louise, and so we've paid a lot of attention. But no, we haven't worked either with Dong or Ørsted. But we have in Finland for the last 4 years worked with an equivalent company, probably bigger, which is Neste, which used to be the state-owned oil enterprise, and is hammering out of oil as fast as it can go into sustainable aviation fuels, into renewable energy, into circular materials, and so on. So, and they do use that term transformation, and they do mean it. So there used to be a very small group of companies that one can point to and saying, that's what we're talking about, and that's potentially how it's best done. But the number is growing the whole time. And I was just noticing about 3 days ago in the Financial Times a piece on Toyota. I have worked with Toyota in the past, and through the hybrid period and so on. But you will have seen that their model for electric vehicles, into which they're quite a late entrant, is to basically own the cars forever and the materials that are in them, including the rare earth materials, to lease the cars out and properly set up some form of circular dynamic there. So there's some really interesting business models and approaches starting to surface in all of this. So it's one of the things that keeps me semi-optimistic much of the time.
I believe it or not, there was a very successful Dutch-Belgium bank called Fortis.
Yeah, I remember that.
So they were, financially extremely successful, and they reached out to me to say, we want you to speak to our board. Why should we go in the direction of sustainability? I said, you've got 15 minutes. That's it. Over dinner. So I met with, I didn't need that much time because they were pretty much convinced. They just want to know what their competitors were doing. And then they started one of the most innovative things. Unfortunately, they went bankrupt because they tried to swallow ABN AMRO. And they created a totally independent advisory group, not reporting to the board of directors and not reporting to the shareholders, completely of independent experts on sustainability to move them forward. Unfortunately, the bank, didn't work out. So I found that actually it's not really that hard to get buy-in. The real challenge that we've always faced is access, not so much the convincing, but the access. The more zeros or money they had, the more isolated they were. So in your case, I would imagine a lot of these C-suite reached out to you, didn't they?
They did, and just on advisory boards. I mean, I've served on over 80 boards and advisory boards since I started, and I currently chair two advisory boards, one for Novartis
Oh yeah.
and one for Neste. And I think done in the right way, they can be hugely powerful. But yes, our business model is peculiar. It's to do the sorts of things that catch people's attention, and then they come, and in a sense, they have to almost negotiate to work with us. I'm slightly over dramatizing for
No,
effect.
no, no.
That is
That's quite a
largely
catch.
it, which is it's how I am happiest to operate, in the sense that I'm part of that Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and Oxfam generation, and I've always felt that I am at some level an agitator and an activist and so on. And I don't want to be a pure play capitalist or even commercial person in all this sort of space. It has to be around a strategic conversation with a particular company. And if they make the decision to at least test you out, just as I said earlier on, I think the dynamics are rather different.
I'm going to take one of the questions from Jacob Hoon from Utah. What advice do you have for everyday individuals who don't have sustainability superpowers like you to help nudge the market in the right direction towards sustainability?
Well, I mean, thank you for the question, and I never think that I have superpowers at all. But what I would say is, what got me to doing what I currently do is just showing interest, reaching out to people, having conversations, both inside organizations I happen to be involved in, but much more typically in the outside world, and where I could, bringing those people inside. And it's amazing, even if you consider that you're sort of a fairly ordinary person in a particular business or organization, that no one will listen to you. It's amazing how many people on the outside are interested in having people show an interest in what they do. And if you do that, and whether they're critical of your organization or not, if you strike up the right sort of conversation, then there is something there around convergence with that reality and the reality in your organization, and you can possibly broker growing connections between them. So be curious, be nosy, reach out to people, be generous in a way that give of your time, give of your thinking, in the sense that people respond very often, and they reciprocate. Study, really try and understand what it is that your business or organization is currently doing and how that might evolve over time. So when you're suddenly asked that question, I had one of these conversations earlier on this morning over breakfast. Somebody said, if money was no object, what would you do? Be ready for those sorts of questions, just in case they come up. And the likelihood is, as we go through that inflection point, as this stuff becomes emergent reality, as just ordinary people wake up to the fact that this is their future and they better get their brains around it pretty fast, you're going to start to find fellow travelers, and in a good sense. I mean, fellow travelers were often what communists were called, or communist supporters, but I use it in a positive way. Just so be prepared for the questions and the moments when they come. And the final thing, I've always dismissed younger colleagues who said, you really, really, really need an elevator pitch. And my response has always been, if somebody does not have time to have a sensible conversation with me or us, it's not going to work. And therefore, sort of having something that's prepared that's going to be 25 seconds long, I'm not interested. But having said that, at least be prepared if that opportunity comes along and you're suddenly in the elevator, the lift or whatever with somebody critical, and they happen to ask a question. Be ready.
Thank you. That was actually Jacob is a storyteller, and he makes these fantastic
and tell stories. Yes,
video. He made a great video for us explaining what the Better World Prize is. So,
I'd love to see that.
Okay, I'll send it to you. He's really very good. Derek wanted to know, what is the role of product business model innovation to frame the right narrative for impact. Do you have any example that you might be able to share?
Well, I think I mentioned Bill Ford earlier on, and when I was working with the Ford Motor Company in the early part of this century, it makes me seem grotesquely old, but I probably am. But in 2003, I noticed Elon Musk and what he was doing, and I said to people in Detroit, that's interesting. And the response I got was, actually, no, it's not terribly interesting. We tried electric vehicles 100 years ago. It didn't work. And so not terribly interested. And Musk, as we all know now, has turned one sector after another on its head. And what does he do? Well, he tells a story around his products, which are around, firstly, what people want from the product. I mean, they want speed, they want elegance, they want luxury, they want all of this good stuff. I want range if it's an electric vehicle. But around that, he weaves a broader story. This is something about changing the world towards a more climate-friendly set of outcomes and so on. So I'm not saying that Musk is the answer to every maiden's prayer, let alone Twitter's, nor that we should understudy him relentlessly. But I do think he's got this sort of interesting combination of a superb engineering brain, a capacity to take humongous risks, but to tell interesting stories around that, whether it's the Boring Company, whether it's SpaceX, whatever it happens to be. And his Neuralink company sort of coming up behind. So I think storytelling is fundamental. And alongside that, one of the things I've often found is a certain lightly playful in situations where you're not meant to be playful. That's really, really, I've been struck at how helpful that can be, where in effect what you're doing is you're signaling to people you're not an absolute missionary, you're not the zealot, you're not the ideologue, you're prepared to be playful even with your own agenda. If you can do that, I think that's actually quite helpful.
What are you focusing on now? I mean, you're still writing books, I see. You've written several. Is most of your time now totally committed to Volance and the advisory board jobs?
It is. I mean, I've just finished yet another book, my 21st. I'm working with a possible co-author on a 22nd. And, I often say that when I'm working on a book, that's when I'm happiest, because I can be legitimately sort of curious. But yes, pretty much all the work I do is through Volance. And so I'm hooked into all sorts of different projects. On Sunday, 3 of us go to Dublin to work with the electricity supply board there, which supplies all of Ireland's electricity. But at the same time, last week I worked with the top 50 people in the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. A couple of days back, I was with the Crown Estate. That's the sort of the British royal family's property company. So very substantial property and land holdings, but they also control the seabed and the continental shelf around the British Isles. So working with a range of, and what's peculiar about those is that for much of the history of Volance, the bulk of our work has been outside the UK, and it continues to be very largely international. But we're seeing a lot more interest in what we do in the UK, and it partly because of the incoherence of the government of the day, and that's not a new thing here. It's a bit like the United States, with the greatest respect, when Trump was in control. And I think we are at an extremely dangerous moment in all of this, where we actually need not a revolution, but we need massive disruption in terms of the political class, the people who are actually running our countries. They are, for the most part, clueless. For the most part, they don't understand what is going to be required of them. And I can't remember now who said it, but it's rattled around my brain ever since. It may have been Winston Churchill, I'm not sure. But there was this saying, extraordinary times call forth extraordinary leaders. And I think we're going to see that over the next sort of 5-7 years, where we're suddenly going to be seeing political leaders come up who are dramatically different. from the ones that we've been used to. And if people say, but surely CEOs and business leaders and investors can wade into that space and do their bit. Yes, they can do their bit, and they can call for these sorts of changes, but they're not democratically elected, so we shouldn't allow them to have too much power and influence. We need people who we can vote in and vote out.
What can this audience do that's watching this live, and the ones that will be watching the replay do to help you?
What a lovely question. I don't think that we ourselves need a massive. Well, everyone needs help, and every organization needs help, clearly. But I don't think we're in desperate need of that. What I would like is for people to have that confidence that things are going to change, and in a much shorter period of time than we might, the past might have us believe, that they would have ambition. And if they can't do it within their current roles, that they might think about moving somewhere else. But that sense of that understanding things are going to change, and very powerfully the ambition to play their personal piece. If anyone wants to send me a suggestion or a question, my email is john, JOHN, @volans, VOLANS.com, and I answer as far as I possibly can every email that comes through. So if you've got a suggestion, I never say no, but nothing, Robert, thanks for the question, but nothing immediately springs to mind.
Well,
but just do the best that you can in the same space.
We send everybody who registered the link to the replay, and then I'll add your email. And if you want me to add anything regarding your books or the work that Valence do, let me know, and I'll add that. You said a couple of really important things about the sales and marketing. We never had a sales and marketing department. I think it was mainly because of cost, but it worked out. Actually, it's kind of a mixed bag because you don't have sales and marketing. People are very sloppy in responding. So I like the fact that if people are not going to take the time to listen to me, I'm out of here. So I like that advice very much. I just get frustrated that the people don't respond because we don't have a sales and marketing people to chase them down. And the fact that you're saying be generous.
Well, I do believe in the right sort of generosity, but I also believe in the right sort of marketing if it's done in the right way. And we have a colleague who joined us relatively recently, and that's his background with companies like Tech Mahindra. And I'm trying to rein him in at times because I do not want to do normal sales and marketing. But where, I've had briefs for the first time ever of who I will meet at a major meeting with photographs of people and things like that. This isn't to drive particular conversations, but just so I know who I'm dealing with. I don't mind that sort of, almost market intelligence work. And many big companies have to have sales and marketing. I'm not saying that that's we should, none of us go there. But I have a particular personal aversion. I don't know why it is. I also completely numbers blind. So even though I've been behind 4 businesses to date and they all still exist, that's largely because other people have numerate brains. I can't look at a spreadsheet and not want to cry. So, but again, you need people of all sorts and to run a successful business. So hopefully there continue to be some sort of need for people like me.
So we don't anticipate seeing you doing a pitch at Shark Tank or Dragon's Den in the near future.
The whole idea just gives me the shudders.
No, I totally agree with you. One final point, because of the war in Ukraine, energy prices have gone through the roof, and I seem to be in a minority. I'm not really, it's terrible about the war, but I'm happy that energy has become expensive because we were so wasteful for such a long time, and it's forcing people to rethink how they use resources. How do you feel?
Well, it's funny, and I said in answer to an earlier question, we don't work with for example, the defense industries.
Mm.
But in the last 3 years, I've worked for the Ministry of Defense and for the Carnegie Institute on
Mm.
defense and security and so on, because these organizations are increasingly concerned that climate change is going to create a whole
Mm.
series of ricochet effects around forced migration and so on. I think the most, I mean, the war in Ukraine is absolutely horrific, and the abject horror of the human rights abuses and the executions and all the rest of it, which will increasingly come to light, is just a reminder of how absolutely frightful war can be, and a reminder too that war never goes away, and therefore one of the things I've been very struck by is the way that another into people's language, and that's security. And you mentioned, Robert, energy, and energy security is there with a vengeance. Food security is coming very heavily up the curve, or very powerfully up the curve. Climate security, water security, you name it, security. You're going to see a lot more interest in that. And that takes you in a different direction than that sort of everyone on board for globalization. Let's have a wonderful time together. It takes you towards autarky. It takes you towards energy independence. It takes you towards nationalism. And I think we're headed into a period, whether we like it or not, where this huge, great sort of globalization experiment of ours over the last sort of 30 plus years doesn't end. It's not going to go back into the box. But I think deglobalization is going to be a very, very major force that we in the sustainability space are going to have to deal with. And actually, it's one of the coincidental benefits of regeneration as a concept, which is one of the things that in the most recent book, Green Swans, I talk about the sort of the power of regeneration as a concept for business and for financial markets and so on. But one of the things about regeneration is it's place-based. And what we've had over the last few decades is something about colonizing space. I mean, literally, as with SpaceX and so on, but also just going out there and market space and so on. Now, place is going to become very much more important, and I think that's a trend, a shift that we should be aware of and make the best use of. But I hope that it comes across. I mean, I sometimes am accused by younger people of being a sort of an Old Testament prophet, because I say that we are going towards climate chaos.
Yeah.
I've worked with the World Wildlife Fund for many decades. Their report last week, which was the Living Planet report, showing a 70% crash in wildlife since 1970. This is disastrous. I mean, it's beyond appalling. We're going to have to pick ourselves up and start to act in very different ways. And finally, sustainability is becoming political. It's becoming politicized. That's not always helpful at all, but we're going to have to do the politics as well. It's no longer about selling a business case or whatever it might be. We've got to be increasingly political.
John, it's always a joy. I know you're working on your 22nd book. So I promise to end on the hour. I really want to thank you for doing this. I just want to take a group selfie for the millennials among us. Just wave to the camera and it'll take your photo and then add it with all of the others that are in the room. And I want to thank our entire production crew for making this webinar possible. Sam, our producer, crypto genius, and ramen critic, Ricky, my absolute better half with no filter, Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity, Vladimir Putin, military strategy and human relations advisor, Elon Musk, our humility coach, and Liz Truss, responsible for U-turn driving instructions. Thank you all very, very much. I'm going to run a short mixer after this. John, I know that you're really stretched. You're welcome to come, but if you have to go, I'll understand that. So thank you so much for doing this. I really, really am very grateful. And thank you for all of the very, very important work and the pearls that you gave to us today. Thank you so much. I'm
Thank
going
you,
to go
Rob.
right into the mixer. You stay well. And if you want me to share anything with those who register, just let me know other than your email. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.
You stay well.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. All right. So we will just run right into the mixer. See you all